My name is Quang Do. I am German Vietnamese. I currently live in Singapore. Here I work for Google's Vietnam team, something that I've been doing since 2019. I founded a community for Vietnamese professionals. It's a global community, so basically people like me, like you, everyone who was raised overseas or who went overseas for work or for studies. And so this community, I have grown to 30,000 members now. I'm excited to tell you more about what I'm up to and what the community is up to.
Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience from all over.
Where did you grow up? You said Germany, and how did your family get there?
Yes, so the story is my parents are from the north, and back then, the former Soviet Unions, they had a pact with the Communist Party, and so a lot of northern Vietnamese or Vietnamese in general were sent in the late 80s to receive work training in the former Soviet Unions like Czechoslovakia back then, Russia, Poland, Bulgaria. And so my parents were part of that. My mom was 20, I think. My dad early 20s, and they were sent to, or they were given the chance, so to say, to go to Prague in the Czechoslovakia back then. And they met there. They didn't leave Vietnam together, but they met there. And they told me the story that back then they received work training, and it was a gender split. There was a camp for women, there was a camp for men. And so they met at night, very romantic, fell in love. And then in 1990, what happened was the Berlin Wall fell in Germany. So the neighboring country, Germany, was also divided into East and West. And so what happened was Germany reunified. And as part of that, many Vietnamese from the former Soviet Union, because in 1990 the Soviet Union collapsed as well, went to Germany basically for the hopes of better economic opportunities. And my parents were part of that. So they immigrated to Germany. I came in 93, and they stayed ever since. I was born and raised there. And they arrived in central Germany. And I grew up there until I was 6. And then they bought a restaurant from another Vietnamese family. That family had 2 restaurants, and they bought one. So they took over operations, and this was in southern Germany. Stuttgart is the city called. That's where, Porsche, Mercedes. It's a very automotive heavy city. That's where I basically spent my year 6 to 18. My parents are still there, small town next to Stuttgart, still running the restaurant. And I left to Munich with 18 to study. And so that's where I grew up.
What did you study in Munich?
I studied business and computer science. It's like a double major program. And I did a master's in that as well at the Technical University of Munich. So I'm a businessman / computer scientist by training.
That's a powerful combination.
It's has proven to be at least in presenting myself, it's a strong narrative to use. Yeah, that's true in our current world.
And what was it like for you to grow up in Germany as a Vietnamese boy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, many Vietnamese came from the former Soviet Unions to Germany, and many of them ended up in Berlin or former Eastern Germany. My family ended up more southwards Germany, and so what was particular to my upbringing was that I didn't grow up around too many Vietnamese. My parents had a couple of friends, but they were adults, so I didn't have many peers in my age. So I remember from age 6 onwards, before 6, when we were still in central Germany, I had 2 best friends, Long and Ming, and we were 3 guys, the only 3 Vietnamese in the kindergarten. But then we split because of the restaurant opportunity that my parents took up on. And so from then on, I basically grew up with many other immigrants in Germany. I didn't necessarily hang out much with other Germans. Reason being is that in Germany, there are many different immigrant groups. There's a huge Turkish population. There are many people from the Slovak countries. So I grew up with Bosnians, with Albanians. I grew up with Russians as well. And so we sort of formed a group of friends, very diverse, of immigrant Germans, so to say. So I grew up amongst these cultures, and how you can imagine it is those cultures are very different from Asian cultures. So I sort of had three cultures that I grew up with. One was the more Asian Vietnamese at home. Um, the German one was in school because I had many German classmates as I went to the better schools typically, and then after school in my free time I would usually hang out more with the immigrant groups, and so there was a lot of clash in cultures, I would say. And growing up, I had a good time just being a young boy doing a lot of exploration. I grew up in a small town, so there was a lot of boredom, and what we did was we played a lot of soccer, a lot of football. This was the only thing that mattered for many of us. I was always someone who hang out mostly with boys, actually exclusively, and so I grew up in a very I should say macho culture. It's very typical for the more immigrant groups in Germany, and so I learned up. I grew up having to prove myself a lot, in a more sportsman kind of way. I also learned what very deep friendship was, and so early teens, I wasn't so curious about my Vietnamese identity much. I tried more to fit in into my peer group. I tried to fit in more into my group of friends, and I emulated, right. I became more and more culturally like them as well. So trying to prove myself a lot of became very competitive in terms of everything related to sports, or proving to be strong, or standing for yourself. And I still carry that with me up until this day. Many Asians here, I live in Singapore now, would perceive me more as extroverted, would perceive me more as confident. I believe that traces back, that stems from that time on the soccer field, and with these kind of people. And so growing up was a lot of that, and it changed a lot when I went to study in Munich, because the small town where I grew up, right, there was no university. It was very, so everyone after 18 years would leave. So there's a lot of young population, a lot of very old population, but that sort of 20s demographic would all not be there, and so basically all the fun wasn't there either. And so when I went to Munich, which is more of a wealthy city in Germany, the kind of people that I would be exposed to would also change. More German, more wealthy, more educated as well, because I went to more of the better universities in Germany. And so from then on, I started to um, be more conscious about my career. I focus more on studying well, whilst in my teenage years, I was more focused on trying to become a good football player, having hopes of becoming professional even.
Oh.
But those hopes were crushed with 16, around 16, where reality hits. But I never was like really, really good in school. I always maintained well. I did okay. But my more sort of career drive and more career focus just developed with my 20s, when I was in an environment where it was cool, and it was being something honorable to be good and smart and successful in that sort of sense. And so that came, yeah. And then if I should I just continue telling my story?
Yeah, but let me stop you right there so I can ask, your history and
Uh-huh.
the other diaspora, Vietnamese diaspora history is a little bit different because of the opportunity that your parents had to go to Vietnam under the circumstances that they had left from Vietnam was very different. And your
Yes.
upbringing is very different from, let's say, the Vietnamese diaspora in the United States, France, and Australia, perhaps. And that's one separate issue. But the other issue is Germany's very colorful, let's shall we say, colorful history
Yes.
during World War II. And the question that I have is the German viewpoint of race relations and identity, as I
Mhm.
can imagine, and I'm only imagine, only imagining how different it is being raised in Germany and being around Germans with that kind of history. How was your Vietnamese identity perceived to yourself in Germany growing up in those years? What did you think of yourself? Did the Germans point it out? Did they make fun of you? Did they accept you? What are the ways that the Germans viewed Vietnamese at the time?
I love that question. So the first thing that comes to mind is really that I, not struggled a lot, but the one thing that I remember most vividly is my name being misspelled, or people struggling to say my name, right? Because mm, I now call myself Quang, but my full name is Quang Huy, right? And so these are two words, which is very common for us Vietnamese, right? Having two words as a name.
Yeah.
And for German, this is like really weird. People sometimes have middle names, but they would never use it in, in using their name. And so one, I had two names on paper, and also it was hard for them to spell, right? And in Vietnamese, if we say Huy, if you say it in German, it's more like a, a tone of, it's like Huy. It has no meaning, um, but it's easily to make fun of. Um,
Hmm.
despite it not having any meaning. And so that's one thing that I remember very clearly, that I was always remembered that I'm sort of different than others, because whenever the teacher would read out names, I know when she would stop, that it would be my turn now. She's now trying to pronounce the weird name on the list, right? So this is one thing. Um, if you would ask me more about the discrimination, racism
Yeah.
element, I didn't face that in a hostile way. What I, for instance, heard of my American counterparts, from my American counterparts, or people even growing up in Eastern Germany who faced more of, more hostile racism, discrimination, even, violence in some sense. I didn't have that. I had some, mockings here and there. People made fun of tiny eyes and all of that, but it was more in a fun way,
Yeah.
typical children's kind of way. And so I never really felt, slighted or alienated by the people because of that. Quite the opposite, actually. If I think back about the question that you asked, about what sort of made me feel Vietnamese, right? Or how did I perceive my Vietnamese zeness?
Yeah.
Um, then what I mentioned in the beginning, comparing myself to my peers back then, I always felt that I was more on the weaker side. I'm skinny naturally already. I'm shorter than my other peers, and so what I felt is I always felt weaker, right? Just biologically, physically, which wasn't a too big issue, because on the soccer field I was fast.
Yeah.
I had a good technique, um, but this was one of the things, because I grew up with very manly, very strong people, like the Turkish, more Balkan people, would grow beards very early,
Hmm.
and they would, develop more manly features more early than me. My beard grew relatively late. Like even now, it's not very
Yeah.
even. And so this is more on the physical side, right? I was reminded, being Vietnamese, when I came into my teenage years, when bodies develop and when boys become men. And I was just a little bit slower when it came to that. And it was very apparent, very clear when I was comparing myself to the others. Because naturally we were comparing a lot, soccer is a physical sport. And so you are in the changing rooms, you see everyone's bodies, and some people just develop faster than others, and this is one of the things I remember back. Yeah.
Yeah, and I asked this because you eventually make your way to Vietnam, and
Mhm.
you work, in Asia, and so that's like
Yes.
sort of like I wonder what the impetus, what was the reason that you began to sort of think of your way back to Asia, and so what the journey of getting back to Vietnam and to Asia is interesting to me, and it's interesting to see sort of what you were growing up with, but it doesn't sound too culturally tough. It was more like the physical side, the male side of competition. So, what led you to going to Asia and spending more time there?
Yeah, that's it wasn't one incidence of an event that happened to me, but it was very gradual, and part of it was me just growing up. That's how I would put it. That's the real version of it. So um, when I moved to Munich, I studied there. I was also in a big city where I had more exposure to other Asians and Vietnamese as well, and so I had a group of Vietnamese friends with whom I very easily connected, and I saw myself in them, and I just felt a lot of things that I would relate with them easily, and so that sort of sparked the um, initial interest as well. I had a Vietnamese German girlfriend as well, and at some point, so with her it was more naturally that we would also talk more about commonalities, cultural things, cultural values as well, that just came. And just me growing up, I started to read more up on history. I ate more Vietnamese food as
Mm.
well. So I didn't have too much access to Vietnamese cuisine in my small town, like, besides the food from my parents, and so everything came together, right? And so there was one sort of cultural stream where I just wanted to discover and explore more, and then on the other hand, there was another stream of me wanting to find out what I want to do after school. So there was the career path, and there was the cultural heritage part, right? And those two combined, then I also read more about economy. I spoke more with Vietnamese from overseas as well, because that's when I started to found the community. A bit story there. It was really that I was looking for jobs for myself
Mm.
on LinkedIn. I was starting to use LinkedIn more. I set up my profile, uploaded my profile picture, filled out everything, and back then I wanted to get into VC. I still remember it was one of the hotter jobs back then. And VC is a industry, or yeah,
You mean
a role where
venture
with
capital?
yeah, venture capital, yeah, where it's very difficult to get in. It's quite exclusive. It's a small scene, and so it's very relationship driven. It's really about who you know, and warm intros and all of that. But my parents being working class, I didn't have connections basically anywhere, not
Yeah.
even to normal corporates or companies. And what I did was then just thinking that there are Vietnamese out there who are ahead of me, who are more successful than me, who might be willing to help me as a fellow Vietnamese, right? The only missing link would be really to have that connection. How would they know that I would need help, and how, could they offer help to me? And so what I did was I was looking for existing Vietnamese groups on LinkedIn. I didn't find properly moderated ones, properly set up ones, and so I just started it with the very generic name, Overseas Vietnamese, and
How did you know? How did you know that they weren't proper? Like, what did you mean by the groups weren't set up properly, wasn't moderated properly, wasn't ran properly? What do you mean by that? It's
yeah, so
interesting
the name,
that you
yeah,
noticed that.
yes. So um, one, it was just a hunch. The names weren't, they were like IT workers in Vietnam, and the moderators were um, having a logo as a profile photo, all of that, or groups with just 20 members. And so there wasn't just any proper group where I felt this is properly moderated, it's properly structured, there's a meaning behind it, there's a purpose behind it, there's a team behind it. Or all those Facebook groups where you go in and you just see spam and a lot of like random posts, no one is filtering, or no one is checking the quality of the post. And so that's what I stumbled upon, that's what I found on LinkedIn. And I also felt back then LinkedIn wasn't as as prominent in Germany, at least. And so I just started one. Right, I just started one. And the thing about Vietnamese, about us, is our names are very easy to identify, right? We have very particular names. So if you see a Nguyen, they are Vietnamese, 99%. And so what I did was just inviting all the Nguyens from all the top companies into the group. So the group grew pretty fast, because one simple LinkedIn search would reveal all the Vietnamese, right? And then I added all into the group, and from there it just grew. It grew, and people joined me on the mission and wanted to be part of the organizing of the management team. And I onboarded more, and then we had a team of folks who then set out to organize various things. And up until this day, we run a team of volunteers, and we are in over 40 plus cities in the world. And there are meetups every month in almost all cities where there's a Vietnamese population. So this is fast forward, but back then, just me creating the group
On
was already,
you created
yep,
the group on LinkedIn, you said?
yes, that's where we started. That's where it originated.
It's
And
amazing. What an amazing origin story. These things like in business, it's like you find what is missing, you find the niche that people need, and you create something that is really a value to the community that you need yourself. And with a hole in that sort of that segment of the world, you
yeah,
can create something of a lot of meaning and value.
correct. Yeah. So this is yeah, you just said it. It's really a community that I would want to have myself, that I would want to be a member myself, or that I would have wanted to find myself back then. And so didn't exist, and just started it, not with much thought behind it, because like I just told, the initial motivation behind it was more selfish, so was more benefiting me. And now, of course, it has flipped, and now I'm much more, trying to serve the members, trying to create quality meetups around the world. But yeah, the origin story is really from my own
Yeah.
need.
Necessity.
And
Yeah. Now, what
yes.
what is the main directive? What is the main mission of Overseas Vietnamese?
Yeah, this hasn't changed too much. It over time quite quickly crystallized that the main purpose is really to connect our members. That's one, connect our people, our diaspora globally. But then two, beyond that, is to really uplift and lift everyone, right? And so what we wanted to do is always not only bringing our people together, but also bringing people together in a meaningful way, right? We don't want to be classified as a um, social club, or just social meetups where people just come and barbecue and have fun. But we also want to create connections where people can benefit each other, right? And so what we do is we have a mentorship program as well, where we matchmake people. And in our meetups, we always put emphasis on having at least one agenda item where people would share a story, or share something inspirational, or share even in workshop style some learnings or insights from the industry. So what we want is always have a vibe or an element of learning as well, and self-development and mutual support, right? And friendship from that can develop, which we encourage, but that's not the primary meeting reason, right? And so that's sort of the distinguishment to maybe other social groups or more local groups, that we really claim to be the community for Vietnamese professionals, and it's really aimed at creating value in the sense of professional value and self-development and mutual benefit for us.
That's a great mission, and I think there's a lot of intentionality behind setting up these meetups, because without that, it's just like you said, it's just a barbecue and people just get together to hang out. Now, when is the first time you got to Vietnam?
Oh, this was when I was either 7 or 8. So I remember being on Vietnam Airlines, and it was summer vacation time in Germany, and so I actually wasn't so keen to go. That's what I remember. And back then I was playing Game Boy a lot, Pokemon on Game Boy. I remember I was very consumed in that, and I wasn't so keen to come back to Vietnam. And I arrived there, with my parents, and it was true that I didn't enjoy it that much, because when you go with your parents, at
Yeah.
least for my family, you would visit everyone. You would take naps at noontime, which I hated as a child, of course. So I really longed to be back in Germany with my friends, being on the soccer field or going swimming. Um, and I remember just being a lot on the Game Boy, and not being too interested in Vietnam. Um, but then from then on, we went to Vietnam. We flew to Vietnam every 2 years, and over time, I opened up, as I also got more mature. Initially, I resisted to come, but my parents still forced me, luckily. And as I got older, than 14, 15 years, started to converse more with my grandparents, with my relatives, asking them about their background, their history, what their experience. And so then the breakthrough was really when I went with my ex-girlfriend, my then girlfriend, explore Vietnam without my parents.
Yeah.
That's really when I saw the country, with different eyes, and more with an um, explorer lens, which then made me really appreciate it much, much more. But yeah, it was a journey. So you see, it started off very lukewarm, but then over time it became a very strong passion of mine, still
I hear
today.
the story all the time about the first trip going with your mom and dad. I think that's kind of a mistake that most parents, I mean, at 7 or 8 years old, we, most, because I'm taking my kids back, they're like very young, 6, 7 at the time. And I think that Vietnamese children, second generation diaspora children, should go back if they can by themselves the first trip.
Yeah.
One or two trips back by themselves first. That's just my inclination, because I keep hearing these stories that they get turned off going with their mom and dad, being forced to. I was an older guy. I was like in my 20s when I went back the first time with my mom and dad. That was great
Okay.
because I was fully formed. But I think
Yes.
when I look back now, if young people went back by themselves, if they can, without their parents on the first trip or two, to get to know Vietnam by themselves, the
Yeah.
next time they go back with their parents, second time, third time they go back with their parents, there's going to be so many more questions that they have for their mom and dad, and the comfortability and the love for being in Vietnam would be at a different level.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally agree. Yeah, it would have been completely different for me
Yeah,
if I had a different experience back then. But I really saw a very narrow Vietnam.
yeah,
Just being with my relatives, and I wasn't really allowed to go anywhere.
right.
My parents really, until today, still have this notion of Vietnam being very dangerous. Don't be very careful. Don't go out alone. And so, I was always a kid who wanted to explore a
Yeah.
lot. I don't like to be carried, and I don't like to chill. And so I suffered double, yeah, just being at home, and not
Yeah,
being allowed to go out. And yeah, it was boring, but yeah, over time it came, luckily.
yeah, and the thing about Vietnam is so much bigger than we can imagine as children or people that we go with our parents. Because when we go with our parents, many times, especially,
Mhm.
I mean, most people are from the countryside, right? Originally, they have family in the countryside, so they spend a lot of time with their families in the countryside and villages and stuff like that. But
Yeah,
if they get to travel to all parts of Vietnam, Hanoi, Da Nang, Saigon, and they get to go to a lot of different places, especially now because it's so
mhm.
developed, that they get to see the essence of different cities of Vietnam. And it's very different from place to place. It's not what we think. But if we get locked into the village that our parents grew up and all of their friends are from, their family, grandparents, then it becomes a very sort of myopic view of Vietnam. And you go back to America and you're like, I don't want to do that again.
Yeah, yeah. I'm still in the stage of exploring Vietnam. Like you said, it's so flavorful and so diverse. I even remember back then for me, Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, cannot say it, but wasn't so different for me actually. It wasn't very different, but now being older and being much more attentive, and much more observative, and much more out there. I see how stark the differences are, and across
Yeah.
Vietnam, what nuances and what just flavors and colors um, there are across the country. It's really fascinating.
You know, I listen to the conversation and I think about your parents, and they left different circumstances than, all of the other diaspora, and we don't get to explore that as much as Vietnamese Americans. Our story is refugees. Our story is we left the war and it was on boats, and it was a very different situation than being sent to Europe to study or to create a new life. How does your parents feel about returning to Vietnam to live today? How do they feel about how Vietnam has developed? Do they ever have an intention of going back to Vietnam to live?
Yes, they did not up until recently. Now they are being more open to it. They they left Vietnam with the intention to not return. And they are very grounded and very rooted in Germany now. Very good friends with the neighbors. Bought a nice house, and already planned their retirement there.
Hmm.
And so when I shared with them that I wanted to go to Vietnam, or close to Vietnam and to Asia at least, they were very worried, and they were very against it. They said, you have it all here in Germany, you have a degree, why don't you work here and stay here with us? And when it then was Singapore in Google, they changed their mind. They were okay. Sounds good at least. And then just recently they visited me. Whenever they visited Vietnam, for them it was the same like me as a child, right? They never really took the time to travel. They never really took the time to explore. Whenever they come, it was like duties for them. They had the responsibility to just visit everyone. We have a big family, to give relatives money. So whenever it never felt really enjoyable for them, and they shared that openly with me, right? And so this time they came visit me in Singapore, and I said, let's go for a weekend to Vietnam, but let's not tell anyone, and let's just
Oh,
see
wow.
the new Vietnam. Yeah,
Oh,
because even for me, I came in 2 or 3 years cadence, right? And every time things move and change so fast, right?
every
And now
six.
me being, yeah, me being at Google as well in the Vietnam team, I see firsthand, how important the market is, how fast growing economically it is. And so there are plenty of opportunities, especially for a big deal like us, right? And for everyone. And so my parents, and I think many older generations overseas, are either blind to it. They just don't get exposed to it. They don't see it. They don't read it. They don't know it, and they don't try to, even, they're not even open to the idea, right? Because the Vietnam they left is a very different one. But so this one, this time around, I went with them to Vietnam, and I really booked which is the tallest tower in Ho Chi Minh. I forgot the name. But I booked them a room there, to really give them the the very polished, new, modern Vietnam. And they were very surprised, actually, very
Is it
positively
the
surprised.
landmark?
The landmark, correct? Yeah, the landmark. And
Yeah.
we drove around in grab cars and good restaurants. By now Vietnam is not that cheap anymore, right? I earn in Singapore, I spend in Vietnam. Sometimes if you go to the more upscale things, there's not that much difference. And so you see that things just going upwards there, right?
Yeah.
And my parents this time really were um, surprised by the progress, and seeing all the young people making progress, seeing my colleagues at Google who are all well educated, and also Vietnam being much more safer than they assume it would be, or at least feel safer. Yeah, just make them open to the idea to at least split their time, right,
Yeah.
when they retire. Because I for sure know that I will be in this region. I will split my time between Singapore and Vietnam for sure. If not, I will, even buy property in Vietnam and live there. And so I'm my parents' oldest son. I have a little sister as well, and if they love me and if they miss me, they have no choice other than at least visit me. And if they retire, they can extend that visit to 1, 2, 3 months. And I think by now, they're very open to the idea. And me talking to many other Vietnamese, I think for some parents it's a much more difficult journey to reconnecting with Vietnam. For others it's easier. My parents are somewhat in between, but they have a very high level of trust in me. They really have confidence in me deciding what's best for me and my future family as well, and me knowing what I'm doing. And so yeah, me being very bullish and confident myself about Vietnam just makes them feel um, having a higher trust towards the country as well.
That is an amazing perspective. And I want to ask you about Singapore and Vietnam because the close proximity of the two countries, but the distance in terms of financial and law and the way society is set up. And it's might be an ignorant question that that you can discover this on the internet, but I want to ask somebody who is living between these two worlds, how much further and how can we get Vietnam as close to where Singapore is as a society?
It's a good question, but I think it's hard to compare apples to apples. Singapore is a small country, and so it's easier to govern. Vietnam is historically much more rich, right, and is much more deeply rooted in many different cultural historical aspects as well. Um, I try to not to be too controversial here, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
a lot of it has to do also with the way people think and the way some political structures are just set up, and so that's what I also said about the size of the countries, right? Singapore is easier to govern just by size of the nation, and the conditions and the starting points were different for both of the countries, um, and Singapore just had a very very strong and smart leader, I think, and that just came at a very good time. So I'm talking about Lee Kuan Yew,
Yeah, it's one man
one
that
man,
did the
and
country so much
yes,
good.
and so people often call Lee Kuan Yew a benevolent dictator, right? And
Yeah.
so he, for countries like emerging countries, sometimes democracy is not the best solution,
Yeah.
right? And this is a more complex topic. I don't even want to give my full opinion there, but it's an observation. For some people, they're just, or some countries and population, they're just not ready for democracy, maybe. And so Lee Kuan Yew came at a good time where he powered and was someone who wanted the best for his people, and he was very very capable as well. And this, in combination with a small, willing country, a country that is uh, open for change, that struggled for a long time and faced a lot of risk and dangers from neighboring countries, and back then also the Japanese, um, just developed to become a very hardworking, very successful story of a nation, right? Politically and economically. Um, Vietnam might be, a couple of years behind that. We cannot tell for sure now whether it will ever reach, that level of um, of Singapore. What we do know though is that the economic growth thus far looks very promising. Uh, um, and now I think, better than me analyzing more macro level, I can share more about what I perceive
Sure.
on the ground, where I feel the the countries differ in terms of the ways of working and the ways of thinking. And so what both have in common is sort of the drive to work, right? And the same sort of values towards working hard and towards wanting a better life for themselves. In Vietnam, however, it's a bigger nation. It's more split as well in different sort of groups as well. You have different kinds of industries. You have different kinds of economical groups, and so Vietnam was always very, or like recently, very industrial heavy, very manufacturing heavy, right?
Yeah.
Vietnam relied a lot on cheap labor, which was driving the growth as well. So you see a lot of like the Apples or the Foxcons who come there to develop or to produce the airports, Nike before to produce shoes, clothing a lot. And so this is all driven by cheap labor, which resembles China a couple of decades ago. And so this was sort of one of the competitive edges that Vietnam had. And now Vietnam is sort of at an inflection point, right? And this is also more my personal opinion. Different people have different opinions on that. But I believe, to really push through and become a more developed nation like Singapore or other Western countries, Vietnam also has to make the switch to a more high-tech industry or more service-based industry, right? And move away from the low-cost and cheap labor cost sort of structure. And what happens is a lot of the young people nowadays are extremely strong in technical abilities and very well educated, at least in the math and STEM fields. And so that's why also one reason why I'm very bullish on Vietnam becoming a future tech nation as well, because the raw talent is there, right? And what it now needs is probably more skills around company building, around company building, leadership skills, business acumen, even beyond the small business and family business kind of thinking. And so that's one thing that I think, through more international exposure, more internet exposure, more people returning, more experts coming in, and just everything being more globalized, that Vietnam is on a good track to actually become a developed nation rather sooner, and a tech hub as well for the Southeast Asian region rather sooner. When it is, I don't know, but I'm quite certain that it will happen, and that we sort of make that switch and don't have to only rely too much on tourism and all of the other industries, but we can be a very tech successful tech story globally as well.
We have all the components of everything.
Mm.
Industrialization, heavy on factories. We have a very literate population. We have such beautiful tourism. We have natural resources. We have all the things that can really make Vietnam one of the superstar countries coming out of Southeast Asia. And I have a lot of confidence that it's happening. I really do. The more I talk to guests on this podcast, the more I have hope. The United States is very dedicated to sending their embassies, their resources to help Vietnam become a very stable and very prosperous society.
Yeah, definitely. And with OVE, that's also one part of the mission that I sort of personally drive as well. I also want to sort of um how do I say this without sounding too pumped? Like I want to role model that's sort of one model for people like us as well, going considering Vietnam or Southeast Asia to be, the place where you have your career, and where you start your business as well. And so there are success stories already of people coming back. My friend Hao from etc., who I highly admire. A lot of video coming there, even doing traditional businesses like F&B, or starting a gym. This is something that I learn more and more as well. Me coming from the West, me consuming a lot of Western media and newsletters and podcasts. There are many conventional ways of being successful, yeah? And conventional in the sense of starting a business, having a venture capital case, raising money, or being a VC. All of these more conventional signals or measures of success. Here in a more emerging market, you can also have more traditional businesses, which um, would maybe feel like a failure in a Western country more and more. Say for instance, you start a restaurant. If you have a master's degree or bachelor's degree and you start a restaurant in the West, it would sort of feel like you
Waste.
you are underselling yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Whereas here it's quite the opposite. You
Yeah.
can become very, very successful as a business owner, and business ownership, being an entrepreneur in Vietnam, is more the status quo. There are not many institutions of high reputation or high pedigree in Vietnam, and so the way to be successful is really to have one or two or three or a couple of successful businesses that you start, right? um, I see, more and more younger generations chasing more the more Western notions of success, the degree kind of driven success, which is also fine, which I have been doing as well. But I'm just starting to open my mind more towards the opportunity of starting more traditional things. Maybe just going to Vietnam and start a
Yeah.
restaurant chain
You
and
know,
just
the generation that was going back 20 years ago is a funny flip. It's a funny situation where 20 years ago, young men and women would go back to Vietnam and they would be sort of celebrated as Việt kiều, and the respect, and there were things that the returning Vietnamese diaspora would find themselves in a situation of people sort of really wanting to take care of them, and really showing them a lot of respect. But things change. It is not that way anymore,
right.
and the humility of going back as a Vietnamese overseas coming to Vietnam, the dynamics are certainly different because the sophistication of many returning Vietnamese overseas have created a place where oftentimes the Vietnamese in Vietnam and the returning overseas have blended and have been working with each other for at least 2 decades now. And sometimes you can't tell who's who anymore. You can't tell if that young kid was born in the US or the young kid was born in Vietnam because they speak fluent English. Kids coming out of RMIT or Fulbright University, those kids are speaking fluent Vietnamese, fluent English, fluent Vietnamese, and you have no idea where they're coming from. And you realize that they might be coming from even ultra successful families that are entrepreneurs or big government people that have success, and their leverages are different than what we have in the diaspora. So it's a brand new day now in Vietnam when we return as diaspora, as Vietnamese overseas.
Yeah. I hear that notion a lot, that we overseas are often privileged, that we were able to enjoy a more Western education and all of that. But me now being here on the ground, I just see the smarts of the people, and it now it this argument doesn't hold much
No,
too
not
much
at
anymore for me, because really it really mix, like you said, it blends. You have very good people from overseas coming home, but you also have very good people from locally. And you have more the lifestyle people who just want to come to Vietnam, who don't aspire to be too successful and just enjoy the life there. So it now really blends. You have with different classes, different kind of people, different kind of priorities across both
yeah.
sides. And there's no real uh, no real advantage on that is good too much towards anything too much if you were born there or here, right?
Yeah, there's really no
In
advantage
terms
either
of,
way. And I
yeah,
think
in
the
terms of
internet,
life potential. Yeah.
mhm. And I think the internet has really sort of
Mhm.
created this level playing field. You can really take advantage of the knowledge that you can find online.
Yeah. And I see, even culturally, you could even argue, and I see this a lot with the people that I meet. This in the Western world, sometimes you grow up even too, even though you have more access and more opportunities in terms of career in school, you also have an environment that is thinking differently. In Vietnam, the drive and the focus of the parents is still very heavily on education. And although, the families in the West who are Vietnamese, the parents still emphasize that. For instance, for my parents, I know they always wanted me to be good in school. Still, you hang out with other folks, right? You grow up with other kids where that emphasis is maybe not as strong as in Vietnam, right? So comparing yourself with grades and comparing yourself by, the performance that you
Yeah.
deliver at school, this is something much more pronounced in Vietnam, right, or in Asia, and in the West, where, for instance, where I grew up, school, like being successful in school, wasn't that of a top priority, right? And so the environment that you grew up in, even though you're more privileged, might still make you in the end coming out not as, as smart as some very hardworking kid in Vietnam who maybe didn't have the access to better schools, right? But just outworked you basically. And so I see this a lot. This blend of people being, now skilled differently across overseas and local. And there's, you find good people everywhere.
That's a great point. And I worry over the next few decades that Vietnam will reach a pinnacle of success with the ideas of being educated, and they will their future generations will be like Americans, where where we take education for granted. We don't grind as hard. We don't push as hard. The quality of life that we want in America is a few generations ahead of the Vietnamese, because the Vietnamese now are still really hungry for success. So you're right. The environment of everybody around you wanting to push for education and wanting a better life and a better country to prosper is very different in America now. America is, we are at a point where we don't want to grind as hard. And I'm speaking in generalities, but
Yeah.
the ability to really say, let me cancel the noise, let me put my nose to the grind and really work hard like we did in the 80s and the 90s, in the earlier generation, it's kind of
Yeah.
gone.
Yeah. It has a lot to do with culture as well.
Yeah.
This is also a very big element that I see coming from, or seeing both sides really. I'm now 30, right? And so a lot of my Western friends, or most of them, they don't really think about family much. 30 is still, at least on the male side, is still young,
Young. Yeah.
still, find yourself, enjoy your life, you're in your prime, that sort of notion, right? And we also relatively, in Germany at least, start working relatively late. Education is free. We do our masters, which is 2 years. Many of my friends started working with 27, 28, 29,
Wow.
right? Um, and so they haven't seen the real world for too long, right? Whereas in Asia, and it's the same across Singapore and Vietnam, people think about family even when they
Yeah.
like
They're going
22,
through it.
23 already. I have a cousin. He's like only 1 year older than me. He has two kids already, almost grown. And
And
so everything is, yeah,
yeah, and the reason for that is because of generations staying together. You have your grandparents, your parents, and the children all living in one
yeah,
house. You can afford to pursue your masters and have two kids at the
right.
same time.
Correct. And so my point is really what comes with that is you have to take responsibility much earlier here in Asia.
Mm.
And not just for yourself, right? In the West, we are much more individualistic in our thinking. We earn enough to pay our own rent. That's fine. Our parents don't have to take care of us. We are independent. But here in Vietnam, what I perceive is a child will earn for themselves, but they will still try to earn more in order to cover their family, just in case there's an emergency or anything. And they will try to earn more to, take care of their grandparents and their extended family as well. It's almost never enough. You always want to have that safety buffer, right? And you don't have that, you don't have time to waste on finding yourself, or
Yeah.
traveling the world or anything like that. And so you really take responsibility in early years already, and that makes you grind harder, work harder as well, and just being more conscious about overall life as well, because you soon want to have family and kids. This is ideally before 30s, right? As a woman, I think it's even early 20s when
Yeah.
you're in a small
That's
town. And
right.
so all of these factors also contribute to you just working harder because life is just more serious for you.
What does it mean to be Vietnamese to you nowadays?
It's a very deep question. I think something I ran a podcast as well, and I asked these questions to my guests as well. It's so hard to answer because it's so complex. To me, being Vietnamese, I could list attributes and what makes us very Vietnamese, but to me, it's something um, very very personal. Um, I'm For me, being Vietnamese really means. Okay, I think the best way to answer this is to really list some attributes of and traits of Vietnamese, which I really deeply believe is grounded in our culture, right? And it's really the combination of those. And that is one, really hardworking and persistent. We are very, and I hear this from many Westerners as well, who um, know Vietnam from history and who read on history. We are very persistent nation. We have gone through many things, and I think this also might, have transferred through generations in us being just very, um, very persistent. That's one thing. The other thing also coming with that is we are very, hopeful and optimistic in a sense, and that sort of sentiment I feel a lot in Vietnam. People working hard, people also looking forward to a better future, and also coming with that, then people are not very regretful. They don't look back a lot. They don't hold any grudges towards the past, and are really just all sort of tying and working together towards
Yeah.
a better better future for all of us. That's the third thing. And maybe the fourth thing really tying this all together is some sense of national pride as well, and this comes mostly after time, because of course we are biased, but me trying to be as objective as I can. The Vietnamese culture is just so beautiful and so rich, and so many things that we can appreciate, right? And I hang out with Vietnamese a lot, but also non-Vietnamese who say the cuisine is just top notch.
Yeah.
It's everything about our culture and our people. There's so much to be just proud of, and I think the more we grow up and the more we take time to really dig deep into our own heritage, the more we just realize how beautiful being Vietnamese is. And so I think everyone just carries some portion of that pride within themselves, or at least I hope.
Yeah. Now, how would people find your membership or the events for Overseas Vietnamese? How do we get more information?
So the best way to get all information is just to go on overseasvietnamese.com. There you will get access to our LinkedIn group. There you will get access to our Facebook group and to our local WhatsApp groups as well. And we are now in a very exciting stage where we start to roll out and structure things much more. And so you will hear about us if you're on either of those platforms, and there will be a lot of events and things happening in your local city as well, or close to you. And so overseasvietnamese.com.
Quang, thank you so much for coming on today. I, learned a lot about the differences of, Europe, Germany, Singapore, Vietnam, and it gives us a broader view of the culture of Vietnam and how it's sort of all coming together for the future. So thank you so much for sharing all the stories that you came on with today.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed it. Your questions made me think. And yeah, I could talk days and weeks about these topics. But yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.